The sun sagged low over the plains, casting long gold shadows across the open stretch of Wyoming land. Grass swayed in the breeze like old women whispering secrets, and the wind carried a stillness that only came at the end of something, or the beginning. Cole Granger adjusted his hat against the glare, squinting toward a figure on the horizon. Dust curled in the distance like smoke without fire. He'd been fixing a section of fence when he spotted the wagon. Lopsided. Abandoned. One of its wheels half buried in earth, as if it had given up long before its passengers. He mounted his gelding and nudged the reins gently. The old horse obliged, hooves soft against the packed trail. As he approached, a smell met him first, dried sweat, something sour beneath. Flies buzzed around the canvas cover. And then he saw them. 2 girls. Tied to the wooden frame like forgotten bundles of freight. Their wrists roped and red. Their cheeks streaked with dust. One was maybe 17, the other no more than 13. The older sat upright, holding the younger close with what little reach the ropes allowed. Her eyes locked onto his. Not with fear, not exactly. Something sharper. Wary. Phil. Cole dismounted slowly, hands open, palms forward. He'd seen too many animals bolt when they sensed a sudden move. Humans weren't much different. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said softly, knowing they wouldn't understand. Words were wind anyway. He stepped closer, gently crouching. The younger girl's lip quivered. She gripped her sister's dress. The older girl didn't flinch. Her stare bore into him like a nail through wood. Unshaken. Tired. Cole slipped his knife from his belt, careful to hold it so the blade faced away. He gestured once, waited. The older girl gave a barely perceptible nod. The rope fell away with a clean stroke. The younger whimpered and collapsed against her sister. Cole stood and backed up a step. He scanned the wagon. Nothing left but a ripped blanket, a shattered mirror, and a moldy heel of bread. Whoever had left them there hadn't just abandoned them. They'd erased them. He looked down again. 2 girls. Foreign, silent, tied up like property and left like trash. Something moved in his chest. Not pity. He didn't believe in pity. It never helped anyone. But there was a tightness. A remembering. His brother's eyes, once after a raid. The same kind of quiet pain. "You got names?" he asked. They didn't answer. He didn't ask again. The ride back was long and quiet. Cole gave the older girl the reins. He held the younger in front of him. She shook under his coat like a bird pulled from the snow. The cabin came into view as the last light faded. It was small, a 2-room shelter made of pine logs and patched shingles. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. The door creaked open like it knew he was coming. Inside, it smelled of firewood and old tobacco. Cole lit the lantern with a practiced flick. Its amber glow touched the girls' faces, revealing more than the day had allowed. The older one's cheek was bruised, blooming violet beneath the surface. The younger had a gash across her palm, crusted with dirt. Cole turned to the kettle, poured hot water into a tin basin, and slid it across the table. They understood that much. He stepped back, giving them space. The girls washed their hands slowly, eyes darting toward him now and then. Still silent. He pulled down an extra quilt from the shelf and spread it across a hay mattress by the hearth. It wasn't much, but it was warm. Later, he poured himself coffee, black and bitter, and sat by the fire. The girls huddled together, the older one whispering something into the younger's hair. He watched without watching. They didn't ask to be here. He didn't ask to find them. But here they all were. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, a lonely, rising note that wrapped around the cabin like smoke. Cole stared into the fire, his face unreadable. Something about this night, the silence, the stillness, felt heavier than usual, as if the world had tilted a degree, and everything was sliding in a new direction. He rose once to check the latch on the door, then again to stoke the fire. He didn't sleep much. At dawn, he found the older girl already outside, barefoot in the frost, hauling a bucket of water from the well with quiet strength. Her movements were practiced, efficient, not a word spoken. He watched her from the porch. Something in her posture reminded him of someone. Not a woman, a mustang. A wild one he'd once seen corralled by a bounty crew. Head high. Silent. Refusing to thrash or plead. Dignified, even as the world caved in. He stepped down and took the bucket from her hands. She didn't resist. He nodded once. She nodded back. Inside, the younger girl, still curled under the quilt, opened her eyes slowly. When she saw her sister, her face broke into a fragile smile. She sat up and reached for a piece of bread Cole had left on the table. She hesitated, then took it. The older girl pulled a chair back and sat across from Cole. She studied him the way one studies weather, not with interest but with concern. He poured her tea. Steam rose between them. She touched her chest lightly, then pointed to herself. "May," she said. The sound was soft but sure. Cole blinked, then nodded. "May," he repeated. A pause. Then, after glancing toward the sleeping form behind her, she whispered, "Lynn." Her sister. May and Lynn. He didn't say much more. Didn't need to. They sat together in the soft light of morning, the fire still crackling behind them. The kettle hissed gently. Outside, the plains yawned wide and pale. Inside, something delicate had shifted, a name exchanged, a look returned, a weight lifted half an inch off the chest. Cole rose, set his cup down, and walked toward the door. He stopped at the threshold. "You can stay," he said. He didn't look back. Didn't need to see her reaction to know he'd said the right thing. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't know, was that behind him, May's eyes filled with quiet tears. Not because she was sad. Not even because she was grateful. But because for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel invisible. She stood at the window, her hand resting lightly on the pane of glass, watching as Cole stepped out into the wind again. And that's when she saw it. In the distance, barely visible against the sunrise, a rider stood still on a hill, the same man who had tied them to the wagon days ago, watching the cabin, unmoving, a shadow stitched into the dawn. The days that followed unfolded like old pages, soft-edged and slow, warmed by the sun and cooled by silence. Life on Cole's land was measured not in hours, but in the way the sky turned from gold to ash, or how the wind hummed low through cottonwood leaves. May took to the rhythm quietly, like someone who'd known structure once, long ago. She rose early, before the rooster, and swept the cabin floor in small, careful strokes. Her movements were efficient but not hurried, as if time were a ribbon to be folded, not chased. Lynn followed her everywhere, always close, like a shadow with breath. The little girl had grown less fearful, though her smile still came in pieces. She clung to May's skirts while feeding the goats, or sat cross-legged on the porch drawing shapes in the dust with a stick. She didn't speak, but sometimes hummed, high, delicate notes that seemed to come from another world. Cole kept his distance, but not out of coldness. He'd never known how to insert himself into the lives of others without stepping heavy. Instead, he offered in quiet ways, a second biscuit on the table, a new bar of lye soap, a basket for their washing. He fixed the latch on the washroom door when he noticed it stuck. Left a carved wooden horse beside Lynn's pillow one evening, and said nothing about it come morning. The girls noticed. One afternoon, May stood beside him in the field as he mended a post split from a windstorm. She handed him nails without being asked, watching the way his hands moved, broad, firm, like they knew the weight of sorrow and splinters both. When he wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his arm, she offered him a tin of water, eyes lowered. He drank, handed it back, and for a moment their hands touched. Just enough to feel the callous and warmth of each other. Neither pulled away. The shift between them wasn't fast or bright. It was slow, like the thaw after a hard frost, almost invisible, but undeniable. Each shared glance, each softened silence, built something between them. Not quite trust. Not yet. But something that held the shape of it. The town took notice. Cole had always been a quiet sort. kept mostly to himself unless the barn needed fresh paint or a neighbor's mule got sick. But the moment he hitched his wagon and headed into town with 2 Chinese girls in the back, one sitting upright, the other peeking nervously from behind a quilt, whispers rose like dust off the main road. He walked them to the general store for boots and flour. Inside, old Mrs. Hempel clutched her rosary like the devil himself had walked in. The store clerk kept his eyes low, rang up the purchase without speaking. Outside, as Cole tied the sacks, a voice rang out, sharp and familiar. "Trading in foreigners now, Granger?" It was Harland. He stood beside the saloon rail, boots caked in mud, a sneer tugging at his lip. His 2 friends leaned against the post, grinning like they were waiting on a fight. Cole turned slowly. "Get back on your horse," he said. "Come. Clear." "Those girls belong to my cousin," Harland replied, stepping closer. "He paid for their passage. We had plans for him." Cole didn't blink. "Then your cousin is lucky to still have teeth." The silence between them stretched like rawhide. Then, just as Lynn peeked from the wagon again, Cole stepped forward. Not threatening, steady. "Go on," he said. "Keep talking. But know this, I ain't the only one watching." Harland snorted, but he stepped back. Not far. Just enough to mark his retreat without admitting it. That night, back at the cabin, Cole sat alone on the porch with his boots off and pipe unlit. He didn't tell the girls what had happened. He figured they already knew. Fear didn't always speak English. It traveled in posture, in the flick of the eye, in how long someone held their breath after a door slammed shut. Inside, May sat by the hearth sewing the tear in Lynn's dress. Her fingers moved in smooth arcs, even as her eyes darted toward the window every few minutes. Lynn curled up beside her, asleep, a half-bitten biscuit still clutched in her hand. Cole watched them through the open door. The way May's head bowed over her work, the strand of hair she kept tucking behind her ear, the little hum she made, a thread of melody that soothed more than any word could. He'd known women before. But not like this. May didn't perform softness. She carried it, tucked it under grief and discipline like a letter hidden in a coat pocket. She didn't ask for help, but gave it freely. She didn't cry in front of him, but sometimes her shoulders sagged like the whole world had rested on them once and hadn't yet rolled off, and that made something stir in him he hadn't felt in years. Respect. Maybe even reverence. Later, as he cleaned his boots, May approached him with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She placed it gently in his hand. Inside was a folded piece of paper. On it, drawn in clean, careful lines, was a picture of 3 figures standing beside a horse. 1 tall man, 2 small girls. Below, the word home had been written, crooked but unmistakable. He looked up. May stood in the doorway, fingers twisting in her apron. She met his gaze, just for a second, then looked away. The wind shifted. Something had settled between them now. Not a promise, but the soil where a promise could grow. That night, sleep came harder. Not from fear. From change. Cole had spent years guarding stillness like it was sacred. But these girls, especially May, were moving him, gently but surely, toward something warmer. And change, no matter how welcome, always brought ache. The next morning, Cole found the wooden horse he'd made for Lynn placed back on his nightstand. But now it wore a small red ribbon around its neck, tied in a perfect bow. He smiled, tucked it into his coat pocket, and went out to feed the stock. He didn't notice the thin line of smoke curling up from the distant ridge, not yet. But Harland had returned. And this time, he wasn't alone. Morning broke in silence, save for the steady breath of the wind curling through pine and prairie grass. May sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of barley tea, steam rising like ghosts between her fingers. Her eyes, fixed on the wood grain, did not flicker as Cole approached from the porch. He moved slowly, the way he always did around her, like approaching a deer not quite ready to trust. He set down a small leather pouch, jerky and dried apples from the market. May gave a faint nod. The quiet between them had become something gentle, something sacred. not emptiness. A pause that allowed feeling to settle. Lynn was outside with the hens, humming as she fed them handfuls of grain. The morning light dappled through her dark hair like lantern glow, and her laughter, fragile as it was, warmed the air around the cabin. For all her silence, Lynn had learned to laugh again. That, Cole knew, had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with May. Without lifting her gaze, May spoke. "My father," she paused, swallowing something hard. "He worked on the railroad. San Francisco. Came from Hunan before I was born. Said America was a chance to begin clean." Cole sat across from her, waiting. His hands rested on the table, still nicked from fence work, still calloused. He didn't move, didn't interrupt. "We had a home. Small. No wood floors. But warm." Her voice wavered, barely above breath. "Then the tunnel collapsed. 14 men died. My father too." Her hands trembled, just once. "Men from the mission came. Said we'd be taken care of. Said they had a place. A farm. Said we could pray in English." A flicker of something bitter crossed her face. It was not a home. It was work. Long days. Cold nights. No shoes for Lynn. Her mouth thinned. "When winter came and food ran short, they tied us to the wagon. Said someone would find us." She looked up, eyes dry but burning. "You found us." Cole's jaw tensed. He said nothing, because nothing he could say would matter more than letting her speak. He knew that silence was sometimes the only way to honor pain. "I kept Lynn quiet with songs. Humming. Her favorite is the one Mama sang when she washed rice. The only song I remember." Cole nodded once, slow. May's eyes softened, barely, but it was enough to break the tension sitting like stone between them. They sat in that shared stillness for a while. Outside, Lynn spun in slow circles, chasing the hens in a dance only she understood. The wind played in the grass. A dog barked from far off, and then there was nothing but the fire popping in the hearth. "You got kin?" Cole asked after a time, voice low. "Not here," May said. "None who would take us. Not any more." Cole leaned back in his chair. The weight of her truth settled into him like dust on an old saddle, familiar, stubborn, impossible to shake. He'd carried his own ghost. He'd buried them beneath chores and quiet and the ache of absence. But hers had breath and skin. They sat at his table. "You ever think of going east?" he asked. May shook her head. "Where would we go? They see us the same everywhere." Cole didn't argue. He knew too well what people chose to see. Knew what they refused to. That afternoon, he saddled his horse and called for May to join him. She hesitated, just long enough for him to notice, but then climbed up behind him, Lynn tucked safely with Mrs. Abel, the widow who'd begun stopping by with bread and softened eyes. They rode west, past the ridge, down into the hollow where the creek cut through rock like a scar. He slowed when they reached the meadow, a wide stretch of golden grass and wildflowers swaying like dancers. There, he showed her the spot he planned to build a new shed, maybe even a barn big enough for more horses. His voice was steadier than usual, almost hopeful. She listened, her fingers tightening around the saddle horn. When he finished, she leaned slightly forward. "This land, it's kind to you." He glanced at her. "It's quiet." May nodded. "Quiet can be kind." They didn't say more. The air between them was full enough. As they turned back, a crow flew overhead, its cry sharp as a cut. May's gaze followed it to the ridge. "There's someone watching," she said, more to herself than to him. Cole didn't look. He didn't need to. He felt it too, like a chill at the base of the spine. Back at the cabin, the sun was sinking low, painting the walls in honey-colored light. Lynn sat on the steps, her hands sticky with peach juice, cheeks flushed. She ran to May, who lifted her without effort, twirling her once before planting a kiss to her brow. Cole watched, something aching in his chest. A wanting, quiet but fierce. Not for ownership, not for possession, just for closeness. For belonging. That evening, as Lynn drifted to sleep, May braided her hair gently, each motion an echo of every woman who had ever made a child feel safe. Cole cleaned his tools, eyes flicking to the hearth where May knelt, bathed in firelight. She looked up once, and their eyes met. Not briefly, not politely, but deeply, like they were looking through time itself. He wanted to say something then, something that wouldn't sound foolish, but she spoke first. "Your brother. He died." He nodded. "Gunfight. Range dispute. I told him to stay back." "He didn't listen." A long pause. "You still carry it. Every day." May reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded cloth. Inside was a dried lotus petal, pressed and pale, nearly translucent. "My mother used to press these in books," she said. "Said they were for remembering who we were." She placed it on the table between them. No demand. No expectation. Just offering. Cole stared at it. Something in him cracked, but softly. Like ice breaking underfoot, revealing not danger, but depth. He looked up. "You should stay." It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a question. Just truth. May's lips parted. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something older. Something like the beginning of trust. She reached across the table. Not to touch, not yet, but to close the cloth around the petal once more. That night, as the wind rose and the fire burned low, Cole stepped outside for air. The stars above were scattered like spilled salt. Everything was still, too still. Then he saw it. In the far field, barely lit by moonlight, something moved behind the trees. Not a coyote. Not wind. A figure. Watching. The wind howled outside the cabin like a mourning widow, its voice tugging at the corners of the window panes, as if trying to get in. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, dancing up the walls like restless spirits. Abigail sat with her back to the flames, her fingers curled around the chipped ceramic mug that smelled faintly of chamomile and soot. She wasn't drinking, just holding. The warmth was the only thing anchoring her in that moment, the only proof she hadn't drifted completely into the haze of old memories and fresh pain. Across from her, Elijah watched in silence, his hat tipped back, eyes hidden beneath the brim. His rifle leaned against the hearth, forgotten now, as if whatever danger had once stirred it had passed or perhaps changed form. He studied Abigail, not with pity but with the quiet intensity of a man who had lived long enough to know that some wounds needed space before they could bleed freely. "You ever miss the city?" she asked, her voice no louder than a whisper. It sounded strange in the stillness, like it didn't belong there, like she didn't belong there. Elijah took a breath, eyes still hidden. "Only at night. When the silence gets too loud." She nodded. That silence, it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that filled your head with echoes. Her father's voice. The slam of the door. The words, "You shamed this house." She sipped the tea now, if only to fill the space between her thoughts and the room. The bitterness surprised her, and for a moment she nearly smiled. Even comfort, it seemed, came with a sting. The baby stirred from the cradle in the corner. Just a fuss, not a cry. Elijah rose without speaking, his boots making soft thumps on the floor. He moved with a quiet surety, like he'd done this before. Like tending to someone else's child came naturally. She watched him scoop up the bundle, his large hands gentle, cradling the infant like something sacred. A practiced tenderness. That was the first thing that struck her. The second was the expression on his face. Soft, reverent, like the world had narrowed down to that single breath between man and child. "She's warm," he murmured, rocking slightly. "Strong lungs, too. She'll be a fighter." "She already is," Abigail said. "She wasn't supposed to make it. Not with the way I was thrown out." Elijah looked at her, then back to the baby. "Well, she's got more grit in her than most grown men I've met." The words caught her off guard. Grit. Not shame. Not burden. Not mistake. Grit. She wrapped her arms around herself and exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she'd been carrying too long. "Why did you take us in?" she asked suddenly. Elijah didn't flinch. He kept rocking the baby, his voice low. Because the first time I saw you on that porch, soaked to the bone, shivering with a baby in your arms, you looked like someone I used to know. Your wife. My sister, he said after a beat. She left the world the same way you walked into it. Beaten, judged, and alone. I couldn't save her. But maybe this time I could do it right. Abigail felt something stir in her chest. Grief, maybe. Gratitude. Some impossible mixture of both. She swallowed the lump in her throat. You don't owe us anything. He looked at her, finally lifting his eyes, and for the first time she saw the raw truth in them. No. But I still want to. The fire popped sharply, as if punctuating the moment. Outside, the storm shifted, a sudden lull in the wind letting the sound of hooves echo faintly across the distance. Elijah stiffened. Stay here. He moved quickly, setting the baby down and retrieving the rifle. Abigail rose halfway but obeyed. Her eyes followed him to the door where he paused, cracked it open just enough to peer into the dark. What is it? She asked, voice tight. Riders, he said. 3, maybe 4. Can't tell who. Abigail's breath caught. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a caged thing. He closed the door quietly. They're not from around here. Didn't light their lanterns. That's never a good sign. She moved to the baby and picked her up instinctively, her body folding protectively around the child. Could be nothing, Elijah added. But his tone betrayed the doubt. She felt the old fear rise up again, cold and fast. What if it was her father? What if he'd come to finish what he started, to take back what he claimed wasn't hers to keep? Elijah set another log on the fire, his movements deliberate now. Every breath in the room seemed to shorten, drawn taut like a stretched wire. You said she'd be a fighter, Abigail whispered. Well, I think she gets that from me. He looked back, one corner of his mouth twitching into the ghost of a smile. Then we might just stand a chance. The horses stopped somewhere just out of sight. No knock. No voices. Only silence. And in that silence, Abigail clutched her daughter tighter, and Elijah raised the rifle slowly, his eyes narrowing. The doorknob turned. But it didn't open. Instead, a piece of parchment slid under the crack in the door, catching the light of the fire. Elijah bent, picked it up, and scanned the words. His jaw clenched. What is it? Abigail asked. He handed it to her. In scrawled, barely legible writing, it read, She belongs to me. This ain't over. Abigail's knees nearly buckled. Elijah took the baby from her gently, like handing her a shield. Then it's time we stop running. And before she could speak, the door rattled again, this time with force. Rain hammered the earth like a warning, flattening sagebrush and making rivulets out of dust. Joseph stood beside the half-collapsed barn, breath steaming, his eyes locked on the muddy trail where the wagon had vanished. The wind tugged at his coat, but he didn't move. Behind him, the girl stirred in the bed of hay, wrapped in his wool blanket, face pale with fever and lips too dry for her years. Inside the barn, the horses shifted nervously. They knew what Joseph wouldn't admit aloud. Something was coming. Something worse than cold or hunger. He knelt beside her again. Her name was still a mystery, but her boy, Elijah, had whispered enough to paint a picture in Joseph's mind. She wasn't just a woman left behind. She was running, bruised inside and out, fleeing someone who meant to own her, not love her. Elijah sat quietly nearby, clutching the wooden horse Joseph had carved that morning. The boy hadn't said much since the wagon left, but now he looked up and whispered, He'll come for her. Joseph didn't ask who. He only said, Not if I'm standing here. Elijah's eyes didn't blink. You don't know him. Joseph gave a quiet nod. Maybe not. But I know men like him. That night passed like a fever dream. Rain thinned but the cold thickened, creeping into the seams of the barn and bones. The girl, her name, finally came from her own lips just before dawn. Clara, whimpered through broken dreams. When she opened her eyes, she flinched from Joseph's face. Not out of fear, but from the ghost of memory. "You're not him," she whispered. "No, ma'am," Joseph said. "Just a man with a barn. And 2 good ears." Her lips curled at that. Faint, but it was a smile. She sat up slowly, every muscle trembling. "I need to go. Before he finds me here." Joseph didn't argue. "And the boy?" Clara looked toward Elijah, asleep now in a pile of old quilts. Her breath caught. "He's not his," she said. "But he thinks he owns everything I touch." Joseph walked to the door, lifted the latch, and let the golden-gray morning spill in. "You can go," he said softly. "But you don't have to run alone." Clara stared at him. "Why would you help me?" He turned, his voice almost lost in the wind. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it. And maybe you do." Before she could reply, the unmistakable crunch of wagon wheels sounded in the distance. Heavy, slow, intentional. Joseph's hand went to the old rifle leaning in the corner. Clara's breath turned to ice. It wasn't a wagon for trade. It wasn't chance. They both knew it. The man who climbed down from the wagon was as thick as he was silent. Long black coat, gloves, hat pulled low, hiding a scar that twisted down his left cheek. Behind him were 2 hired men, not locals, not neighbors. Mercenaries. Joseph stepped out first. "Morning," he called, voice steady. "You looking for someone?" The man tilted his head, studied Joseph like a butcher eyes a stubborn ox. "That woman you got in there, she belongs to me." Joseph didn't blink. "She's not property." The man chuckled. "That's not what she said when she took my coin. She ran off with my boy." "Elijah," Joseph said, frowning. "You said he wasn't." "He's mine by right," the man snapped. "And she's coming with me." Joseph's eyes narrowed. "Not today." The silence that followed was thick, bloated with danger. The man nodded to one of his thugs. The gun came up fast, but Joseph was faster. The shot cracked through the valley. The hired man dropped like a stone. The other one froze. Joseph's rifle didn't waver. "I only have 2 bullets left," Joseph said. "One's for you. The other's for whatever monster you left behind in her heart." The man didn't move. Behind them, the barn door creaked. Clara stepped out slowly, her face pale but unflinching. Elijah ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm tired of running," she said. "But I'm more tired of being afraid." The man stared at her like he didn't recognize her anymore. "You were nothing when I found you. I was nothing because you convinced me I was." Joseph didn't lower the rifle. But he didn't have to pull the trigger. The second hired man dropped his gun in the mud and turned away. The man in the black coat looked around. No backup. No witnesses but the wind and a woman who no longer bowed her head. "Walk away," Joseph said. "This is your only chance." The man spat, but he turned. "This ain't done." "It is if you keep walkin'," Joseph answered. They left. No words. No fight. Just the groan of wagon wheels fading into distance and defeat. Back in the barn, Clara sank into the hay with Elijah curled against her. Joseph crouched nearby, watching them both with something that wasn't quite hope. Not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. For the first time in a long time. They sat in quiet for a while. The wind shifted. A crow circled above, then drifted away toward the hills. Elijah had fallen asleep in his mother's arms. Joseph stood, walking outside, letting the sky settle its weight on him. He didn't hear Clara follow, but she was beside him a moment later. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "But I don't think I want to face it alone." Joseph looked down at her, voice rough as bark. "You won't have to." She leaned her head on his shoulder. Just for a second. Then a sound split the stillness, faint, almost imagined. Oh, but not from the trail. From the hills behind the barn. Joseph turned slowly, narrowing his eyes. A lone rider crested the ridge. Not law. Not local. And not someone Joseph had ever seen before. He held something across his saddle. Wrapped in oilcloth. Heavy. Joseph stepped forward instinctively. Clara pulled Elijah closer. The rider stopped, didn't speak, just raised one hand and then pointed directly at Joseph, and suddenly the safety they'd fought for felt fragile, like glass, ready to shatter again.